By the end of 1943, in the northeastern reaches of Europe, there existed vast stretches of terrain that remained poorly examined even under the pressures of large-scale military operations. Dense coniferous forests, waterlogged valleys, and stony hills formed a natural labyrinth where the movement of major units was limited and territorial control could only be considered approximate. It was in such an area at the junction of several supply routes that a region lay which would later become notable for an unexpected discovery that altered the local course of the campaign. The landscape retained an unusual quietness for wartime. Long strips of spruce forest were interrupted by narrow clearings cut before the war for logging and transport. According to Allied intelligence, the enemy occasionally used these clearings to move small groups discreetly, but there were no indications of permanent infrastructure or bases. Yet, in the winter of 1944, the situation began to shift. Reports of unusual disturbances along patrol routes increased. Several observation posts recorded vague silhouettes between the trees, traces on the snow, and brief flashes of light in the distance, none of which could be conclusively identified. Military analysts suspected that the enemy might be preparing a covert operation related to the movement of supplies or reconnaissance personnel, but no direct evidence supported this assumption. The Allies possessed only fragments of information, patrol notes, scattered observations, and a handful of photographs capturing indistinct shapes against a snowy backdrop. The general picture remained incomplete and required deeper analysis. At this time, units responsible for the forest sector faced resource limitations. Large-scale offensives were not planned for the winter season, and priorities were focused on other fronts. Nevertheless, command deemed it necessary to reinforce night surveillance to rule out the possibility of significant enemy movement. Any potential risk was taken seriously, since even a small hidden base could provide the enemy with a strategic advantage, enabling disruptive operations along poorly defended lines. A small reconnaissance group was assigned to conduct intensified monitoring. It consisted of experienced observers, cartographers, and specialists in camouflage analysis. Despite their expertise, they acknowledged the difficulty of determining patterns of enemy activity in a forest this dense. The success of the mission relied entirely on the consistency of observations and the gradual accumulation of information. The western section of the forest was considered the most promising and at the same time the most suspicious. This area consisted of a chain of low hills, a landscape where several patrols had noticed faint flashes at night. The nature of these flashes remained unclear. Initially, it was assumed they were reflections of moonlight on metal or fleeting glints from weapon sights. But as winter storms rolled in, covering the sky with thick clouds, the flashes continued to appear. The original explanations no longer seemed plausible. In mid-December, one observation post recorded a type of light unlike previous reflections. It appeared steady, subdued, and lasted several seconds, almost as though it emanated from a controlled, low-powered source. It disappeared as quickly as it appeared. This entry did not cause alarm at first, but it was logged as a possible indication of artificial origin. Later, this minor note would gain unexpected significance. Complicating matters further, the enemy employed extensive camouflage methods. Earlier reconnaissance had shown their ability to conceal supply caches under snow, mask structures with improvised foliage screens, and move in small units to reduce detection risk. In such an environment, even the smallest anomaly, whether a footprint or a glimmer of light, could carry operational importance. Allied command adopted a cautious approach. Instead of risking lives in a large-scale sweep through difficult terrain, the decision was made to continue gathering information until clear evidence emerged. This meant long winter nights, minimal visibility, and the demanding task of recording every subtle shift in the environment. Gradually, patterns began to appear. The flashes observed by different posts followed a discernible rhythm. Their positions shifted progressively toward the center of the forest. Such systematic behavior suggested more than random activity. It resembled a signaling system or a navigational aid used by personnel familiar with the terrain. By late December, staff analysts proposed a hypothesis regarding the presence of a small hidden base. It could serve as a temporary station for reconnaissance groups or a relay point for supply movements. Yet confirmation required precise coordinates and visual evidence. The available data was still too fragmentary to justify decisive action. Still, the trend was obvious. The enemy operated with deliberate intent, utilizing terrain advantages and masking techniques with increasing confidence. During this period, a single object, an ordinary portable lantern, unexpectedly became the key to revealing what had been concealed for months. A seemingly insignificant detail, recorded almost by chance, would soon expose the structure and purpose of a hidden installation deep within the winter forest. In early January 1944, as temperatures continued to fall and the forest became layered with heavier snow, observation routines grew increasingly demanding. Yet these same harsh conditions gradually clarified the unusual pattern of light signals. While natural reflections shifted unpredictably with weather and cloud cover, the observed flashes displayed a persistence that could not be reconciled with atmospheric effects. They appeared at nearly identical intervals and from gradually converging locations. Analysts recognized a developing trajectory. The light sources were drawing closer to a specific zone within the forest that had previously been considered inaccessible. The reconnaissance group expanded its mapping efforts. Using compasses, pace-counting techniques, and limited aerial photographs, many of which were incomplete due to poor visibility, they attempted to triangulate the areas where the lights had been seen. Progress was slow, but a cluster of overlapping estimates emerged. Each marker pointed toward a hollow between two ridges, a place seldom patrolled because snowdrifts made movement hazardous. Until now, the region had been considered of little strategic value. That assumption was beginning to crack. Further supporting evidence came from the snow cover itself. Patrols began to notice subtle disruptions: compacted patches of snow beneath overhanging branches, shallow depressions that suggested repeated foot traffic, and a narrow track that appeared intermittently along an animal trail. None of these findings were conclusive, but they formed a mosaic of unusual activity. While the forest could erase traces within hours during storms, the persistence of such markings hinted at organized, ongoing use of the terrain. During this period, analysis at the operational headquarters intensified. Reports were reviewed not only from the current winter, but from previous months. Archived patrol logs revealed earlier descriptions of faint mechanical sounds, possibly generators or transport equipment heard at night, but dismissed at the time as echoes from distant positions. With new context, these entries acquired greater relevance. The idea that a concealed facility might have existed for weeks, perhaps months, without detection seemed increasingly plausible. The strategic implications were considerable. A hidden base could function as a communications relay or staging point for reconnaissance missions. Its location within a largely unmonitored forest corridor would allow the enemy to bypass frontline surveillance, potentially compromising supply lines and delaying counteroffensives. Even if the installation housed only a small detachment, its intelligence-gathering capabilities might outweigh its physical size. Command therefore requested additional verification before committing troops to a targeted operation. The next breakthrough emerged not from human observation, but from the interaction of terrain and weather. A brief thaw created a thin, reflective crust on the snow, allowing light sources to travel farther across the landscape. One night, an observation post, situated on a rocky outcrop, recorded a steady glow, lasting long enough to determine its approximate bearing. The glow did not flicker like fire, nor did it pulse like a signal lamp. Instead, it resembled the diffuse illumination of a lantern, partially shielded, bright enough to be detected at a distance, but controlled to avoid exposure from above. This event prompted an immediate reassessment. The lantern sighting aligned with the existing map of suspected activity. If such a light was indeed part of a concealed facility, its users likely believed the forest's density provided adequate cover. They might have underestimated the visibility from elevated observation points or failed to consider the reflective properties of the thawing snow. In either case, the lantern became the first sustained, verifiable indication of an artificial light source within the target zone. Reconnaissance teams began preparing for a methodical advance toward the suspected location. Rather than executing a broad sweep, planners opted for narrow, staggered routes that minimize sound and visual profiles. The objective was to document environmental and structural signs without alerting possible occupants. Winter conditions complicated the effort. Equipment froze easily, and prolonged exposure added risk of frostbite. Still, the urgency of confirming the installation outweighed these difficulties. By mid-January, small units moved cautiously along predetermined paths, noting changes in vegetation and snow texture. Broken branches, compressed soil beneath the snow, and fragments of packaging materials hinted at human presence deeper within the forest. At one point, scouts detected faint heat signatures on the surface of a tree trunk, suggesting the recent operation of a concealed heating device or exhaust vent. These findings, though indirect, reinforced the hypothesis of a hidden structure. The convergence of evidence from multiple sources, light signals, snow patterns, archived logs, and close-range environmental anomalies made further doubt untenable. Analysts could now assert with reasonable confidence that an enemy base was operating inside the forest corridor. Its exact dimensions, purpose, and capacity remained unclear. But the lantern, inadvertently exposed during a moment of routine activity, had provided the critical clue needed to bring the investigation into focus. Plans for a deeper probe were initiated. The next phase would require careful navigation, as the enemy's familiarity with the terrain likely exceeded that of the approaching units. The forest, once a barrier to understanding, was now the stage for an impending revelation. The precise nature of the hidden installation that had eluded detection for so long. By late January 1944, reconnaissance operations had shifted from distant observation to deliberate, calculated infiltration of the forest interior. The earlier mapping and analysis provided only approximate indicators, but enough data had accumulated to justify a controlled approach toward the suspected zone. Conditions remained severe. Snowstorms alternated with brief thaws, producing unstable terrain that concealed both hazards and clues. Despite these obstacles, the reconnaissance teams advanced with caution, relying on pre-planned routes and strict noise discipline. Movement through the deeper forest revealed increasingly consistent signs of human presence. Under the dense canopy, snow lay unevenly, compacted in areas where natural factors could not fully account for the disturbance. The pattern suggested repeated foot traffic, likely organized and directional. Occasionally, the scouts encountered small structural anomalies, branches cut at uniform lengths, fragments of wire partially embedded in the snow, and the remnants of packaging materials resistant to moisture. These indications hinted at an installation not improvised, but deliberately established and maintained. One of the most telling observations concerned airflow in the lower sections of the terrain. Certain depressions in the snow emitted faint warmth, enough to disrupt nearby frost patterns. Though the temperature difference was minimal, it implied concealed ventilation from a covered interior space. The possibility that the enemy had constructed an underground shelter or reinforced dugout became a focal point of further analysis. Such a structure would align with documented enemy engineering practices used in remote areas during winter months. The reconnaissance group relayed their findings to operational headquarters, where analysts constructed a composite model of the suspected installation. While the model remained speculative, it suggested that the site likely served as a relay point for reconnaissance activity. Its placement within the forest corridor offered natural protection and multiple concealed approach routes. The estimated size of the base was relatively small, minimizing logistical requirements and reducing the likelihood of aerial detection. Still, its strategic value could be significant, especially if equipped with communications technology or storage facilities. The lantern sighting, previously a singular anomaly, was now viewed as a probable indication of routine internal movement within the installation. Analysts hypothesized that personnel used shielded light sources when navigating entry points or conducting maintenance. Given the density of the forest canopy, they may have believed such light to be undetectable from outside. However, fluctuations in weather conditions had temporarily altered the reflective properties of the snow, allowing the lantern's glow to travel farther than intended. As reconnaissance teams continued their methodical advance, they began to experience secondary indicators of human activity: faint odors of burned fuel, minor disruptions to wildlife patterns, and traces of ash carried by the wind. None of these were distinct enough to confirm the installation's exact position, but together they indicated proximity. The forest, though still expansive and disorienting, no longer appeared entirely natural. It bore the subtle signatures of habitation, layered beneath the winter landscape. A pivotal moment occurred when scouts reached the base of a ridge that had been marked repeatedly on triangulation maps. The snow cover thinned near the ridge, revealing sections of compacted soil arranged in an unnaturally regular formation. Nearby, a cluster of branches concealed a shallow depression that had been deliberately shaped to mask footpaths. Further inspection revealed a series of evenly spaced markings in the snow, likely caused by the repeated transport of equipment or supplies. These observations suggested that the installation lay just beyond the ridge, positioned to exploit the natural contours of the terrain. Despite the increasing evidence, direct visual confirmation remained elusive. Visibility within the forest was restricted to short distances, and sound carried unpredictably through the trees. To compensate, scouts relied on systematic grid searches, recording subtle environmental changes and cross-referencing them with earlier observations. Through this approach, a more precise understanding of the activity zone emerged. The pattern of heat disruptions, structural modifications, and movement trails all converged toward a specific cluster of low ground between the ridge and a frozen stream. Operational leadership evaluated the cumulative findings and concluded that the hidden base was likely within several hundred meters of the scouts' current location. It was unclear whether the installation was occupied continuously or only during specific missions, but the presence of recent activity suggested ongoing use. Command emphasized the need to avoid premature confrontation. The priority remained intelligence gathering, as understanding the base's function could influence broader strategic decisions in the region. Preparations began for the final reconnaissance phase, which would require approaching the suspected location under full concealment. This stage demanded heightened precision. Every movement had to be coordinated to avoid alerting the enemy. The scouts were instructed to document structural details, assess the scale of the installation, and determine its operational significance. The window for such observations was narrow, as changing weather patterns could erase critical evidence or alter visibility. The forest, once merely a barrier to conventional operations, had become the setting for an imminent reveal. Each observation, each disruption in the snow, each faint sign of heat, each structural anomaly narrowed the distance between uncertainty and confirmation. The lantern, once a distant glimmer on a winter night, had set in motion a chain of events leading to the threshold of discovery. The concealed installation, hidden for so long beneath the forest's shadow, was now within reach of definitive identification. The next steps would determine not only its exact nature, but also its potential impact on the unfolding campaign. By early February 1944, reconnaissance units had accumulated enough evidence to justify a final, concentrated effort to identify the hidden installation. Weather conditions temporarily stabilized, offering a narrow window for precise observation. The forest, despite its continued density, revealed subtle alterations that aligned with the analytical models constructed at headquarters. Each environmental clue now formed part of a coherent pattern pointing toward a concealed structure operating within a limited radius. The advance toward the suspected center required moving along partially frozen ground that muffled sound but complicated footing. Scouts proceeded in staggered formation to minimize detection probability. Their objective was not engagement, but verification. To document structural indicators, assess the scale of activity, and determine the operational relevance of the site. The accumulated evidence suggested that the installation was modest in size yet strategically situated to enable covert movement across the forest corridor. Approaching the low-lying area between the ridge and the frozen stream, scouts identified the strongest environmental anomalies recorded thus far. Frost patterns were disrupted in regular intervals, consistent with heat escaping through concealed ventilation. Snow, near several tree trunks, was thinner, indicating prolonged exposure to residual warmth. These observations reinforce the hypothesis of an underground or semi-subterranean facility designed to remain operational during winter. Further inspection uncovered the most conclusive indicator: a section of terrain where snow appeared uniformly compacted in a rectangular formation, measuring several meters across. The edges displayed minimal deviation, suggesting intentional reinforcement beneath the surface. Adjacent to this area, a narrow path ran toward a natural depression covered with a deliberately arranged layer of branches. Scattered fragments of fabric and metal, partially embedded in the snow, provided additional confirmation of recent human activity. Importantly, the scouts detected faint emissions of warm air from beneath the branch-covered depression. The flow was intermittent, but consistent with a ventilation system operating at low capacity. Combined with the lantern evidence, the heat traces formed a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. The base was not only real, but active, maintained with a level of routine that implied ongoing operational value. Operational headquarters reviewed the findings and concluded that the installation served as an intelligence transit point. Its positioning allowed enemy units to observe Allied logistics, enabling calibrated disruption attempts. Although the base appeared small, its close integration with the natural environment made it disproportionately effective. Command viewed this discovery as a strategic turning point, providing a clearer understanding of recent patterns of interference along the supply lines. Having achieved confirmation, reconnaissance teams withdrew carefully to avoid revealing their proximity. The priority shifted from observation to planning. Detailed reports were compiled outlining the installation's likely layout, access routes, and methods of concealment. These assessments enabled higher command to strategize an operation that would neutralize the site without excessive risk or disruption to broader winter deployments. The lantern, initially a fleeting glow, noted during routine nighttime surveillance, had ultimately exposed a facility constructed with precision and hidden through calculated use of terrain. What had begun as an ambiguous signal became the key to understanding an entire network of covert activity operating within the forest corridor. The discovery illustrated how minor anomalies, when examined systematically, could transform into decisive intelligence. With the installation's existence finally established, preparations for subsequent action moved forward, informed by the quiet but exacting work of the reconnaissance teams. The forest's long-held secret had been revealed, altering the strategic landscape and closing a chapter of uncertainty that had persisted through the harsh winter months.